of this video, you're going to have a full and Inspector Calls essay plan that you can literally adapt to any question. If you watch this whole thing through, I promise you're going to be absolutely sorted for an Inspector Calls. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you 3 different points or ideas, and I'm going to show you how you could kind of link it to different characters and which quotes you could use as well. So my first overall idea, and again, this is something to be adapted, is the upper classes perceive themselves as immune to responsibility, meaning they don't have to take responsibility, shielded by the privileges of their social standing, cocooned in wealth and influence, they evade, so escape, true accountability, retreating into their comfort while remaining detached from the harsh realities their actions impose on others. So what we're saying here is that the upper classes, symbolised by like Mr. Burling, Mrs. Burling, believe that their privileges allows them to escape responsibility. Because they're of a higher social class, it means they don't have to take responsibility, or they can get away with not taking responsibility because nobody's going to hold them accountable, and even if they do, they can probably pay their way out of it. So the first kind of idea and how we could link this is I could link it to the character of Mrs. Burling. So for example, this is what I'd say. Say this is kind of the overall point. This is how I'd link it specifically to Mrs. Burling. So she's cloaked in class superiority, meaning superiority, being superior, means you're above others. So class superiority, it means that in society, think of society as a little pyramid, she is in a higher part of that pyramid than others. So like Eva Smith, for example, if we're looking at this pyramid, we have at the top, we have royalty, it's like the king and the queen. Underneath that, we have aristocracy. Now, aristocracy is like lords and ladies. That's where Gerald falls. Then you've got the upper class, which is where Mrs. Burling would fall. Then you've got the middle class, and that is actually where the rest of the Burlings fall, because Mrs. Burling is her husband's social superior. So she's actually above. And then you've got the working class, which is where Eva Smith would fall. So we've got these class systems, and she's class, that's why we should say she's superior. She coldly denies help to Eva, convinced her social standing places her above reproach. So basically means that she can completely deny and dismiss the working class's needs, as we see with Eva Smith, because her higher social class allows her to do that. And she goes, I'm very sorry, but I think she only had herself to blame in Act 2. So we can see, as initially said in the beginning point, she evades accountability. She is saying it is Eva Smith's fault. She only had herself to blame, despite her directly contributing to Eva Smith's demise. And this really illustrates the upper class's ignorance to the lower social classes and their belief that they can be cocooned in these comforts and these privileges, which allows them to evade responsibility, which of course Priestley is very scathing, meaning critical of. And this actually ties really nicely to the Mrs. Burling ideas on responsibility we have on the Light Up Hub, where this, just so you know, that you'll get selected the key quotes analysis, so you can only learn like specific key quotes. But think about she only had herself to blame, and how we can look at the gendered lexicon and how there's multiple influences on why Mrs. Burling is irresponsible, not just because of her higher social class, but also because of her prejudices towards other women and how that kind of links to her insecurities. So we can kind of take this so much deeper and really impress the teacher or examiner by thinking critically about the analysis, not just stating the obvious analysis, pre-learning that and then just adapting it in the exam, and that is how you will get a higher mark. Okay, now let's look at Sheila. So unlike her parents, Sheila begins to reject the illusion of immunity, so she doesn't have to take responsibility, recognizing the corrupt comfort of her privilege. So we can see that Sheila, of course, at the beginning is completely comforted by privilege. She's almost like wrapped in bubble wrap. Think about bubble wrap protects you. She's wrapped in that by her privilege. She doesn't have to accept responsibility. She doesn't even have to understand what goes on in the world because her privilege allows her to be exempt from that. But she starts to see this as a complete illusion, and we see that she basically rejects this immunity, and we can see her even confront her parents about this in the end. She says, you're just beginning to pretend all over again in Act 3. So we can see that actually this illusion of immunity has been completely shattered, and she is now very forthcoming in her recognition of this immunity and the detrimental, so the negative, effects of it. And then the inspector. He acts as the voice of social conscience. So conscience is knowing right from wrong. So social conscience is knowing right from wrong in society. Exposing the illusion that wealth or class can absolve, so free from, moral failing. So we can actually see that how this links, of course, Mrs. Burling represents the privilege who are cocooned. Sheila it basically exemplifies the rejection of this privilege, and the inspector is highlighting the overall privilege and its detrimental, so that negative impact on society, and the whole idea that wealthy individuals believe they can absolve, so free themselves from moral failings. And he says public men, Mr. Burling, have responsibilities as well as privileges. So this kind of completely shattering the idea that the upper class can have all these privileges but not have the responsibility that accompanies it. And that is what the inspector is directly questioning the Burlings on, and therefore directly questioning the audience on. Because when he questions the Burlings, he's also making the audience reflect on that too. Now, point or idea number 2 is that capitalism champions individual gain, so it kind of favours individual gain, often at the expense of others, while socialism is founded on the principle of collective welfare, so kind of sharing out everything, prioritising shared responsibility over personal advancement. Now, this is a bit of a general point about capitalism versus socialism. And again, depending on the paragraph or whatever the question is, you can kind of link capitalism. You could do paragraphs specifically on capitalists like Mr. and Mrs. Burling or Gerald, or you could do specific paragraphs on the socialists like Eric, Sheila, the inspector. So that's how we can kind of link it, comparing capitalism versus socialism. But what I want you to do in your paragraphs is only focus on one character per paragraph. So if you are talking about capitalism, don't talk about Mr. and Mrs. Burling. I just want you to talk about one character in depth, just because a lot of you will find it easier, you'll get better marks. If you try to talk about too much, you might get the analysis a bit lost. So the first one is on Mrs. Burling. So Mr. Burling, not Mrs. Burling, Mr. Burling. Mr. Burling epitomises, so he's the perfect example of capitalist ideology, valuing profit, status and self-reliance above social responsibility or ethical concern. So we can see very clearly that Mr. Burling, he epitomises, he is the perfect example of capitalism. If I was going to make capitalism a person, it would be Mr. Burling. So therefore he values profit, think about he values money, he doesn't value individuals, think about Eva Smith, he gets her sacked because she wants more money. So he values profit over people, he values status, think about when he talks about his knighthood and he's kind of boasting about that, and above any self-reliance or social responsibility. He completely values that profit and status over the welfare of others. We saw that exemplified in his relationship with Eva Smith. And it's very clear in Act 1 when he says a man has to mind his own business and look after himself and his own in Act 1. So this is very clear that that is his priority. He prioritises that profit. He really epitomises capitalist values, and it's always favouring individual gain. It's always about how can I be better? How can I make sure I'm okay? Not of how can society benefit for that. And then we've got Gerald. So Gerald is operating within a capitalist framework. It's a nice little phrasing. Gerald exploits his privilege while maintaining a facade, which means a mask, of morality, revealing how personal gain can be masked as benevolence. Now, this is really interesting because, of course, Gerald and how he's presented as a charming gentleman in Act 1. That's what we get to see. Of course, Gerald is an aristocrat. So remember, aristocrat, as I said about that pyramid earlier, he's at the top of the food chain of society, if you like. We've got royalty, then we've got aristocracy. So he's really high up. But what he manages to do, he can maintain this privilege while actually having this facade of morality. He's this charming man. He pretends to actually care for Eva Smith despite it coming out that he had an affair with her. It's masked as benevolence. Benevolence means love. So he says, I didn't install her there so that I could make love to her. So it's this idea that he tries to present himself in a very heroic light, and we see that in the way that Sheila calls him like Prince Charming. He tries to present himself in this charming way that he's being compassionate, but again, he really uses his privilege to mask that because he is a capitalist in nature. He's all about individual gain, he's all about his status, he's all about profit. He, again, is very similar to Mr. Burling, but operates it and kind of presents himself in a bit of a different way. And then we have the inspector. The inspector serves as Priestley's vehicle for socialist ideology. And that's a really nice phrasing, Priestley's vehicle. Now, what a vehicle is, think about Priestley can't be in the play himself, so almost uses the inspector to deliver that message, to kind of deliver the message of socialism to the audience. And what the inspector is doing, he represents in this kind of overall point, he represents socialism, the idea of collective welfare, sharing out the wealth, having things like the NHS, which got introduced during this time, prioritising responsibility, personal advancement. He's not focused on that, he's focused on the collective and the shared. So we get this idea that the inspector is advocating for a society built on mutual accountability, so everyone is responsible for their own actions, and moral obligation, meaning that you must adhere to your duties and your morals. And this is by the typical quote we could see: we are members of one body, we are responsible for each other. This is in Act 3. And we've got some really, really nice analysis on the Light Up Hub about this, and some critical interpretations, if any of you wanted it. And it's particularly linking this to religion and how he appears quite prophetic, which is a whole separate video, which we have on there for a reason, because it's quite a long idea, but it's a really, really, really nice idea for this quote. But kind of thinking about this whole essence of the inspector's final speech is all about this mutual accountability, this shared collective social conscience, and we know that he is successful in getting Sheila and Eric to adopt this, but not so successful for Mr. and Mrs. Burling. And then point or idea number 3 is Priestley presents a generational divide to highlight the tension between rigid, so hard to change, traditionalism, and the potential for progressive change, with the older generation clinging to outdated values for status of status and self-preservation, while the younger generation to show a capacity for growth and social awareness. So we can see that what Priestley does here is Priestley shows that there is this divide, there's a split between this traditional approach, which is from the older generation, and the progressive change we see in the younger generation. We see the older generation are more obdurate. Now, obdurate means stubborn, whereas the younger, or the younger generation, if you like, are more malleable. Malleable means easily changed. So we've got the obdurate upper class, or the older upper class, and then we've got the more malleable younger classes, or the younger generation. As part of the entrenched older generation, so they're kind of stuck, Mrs. Burling remains firmly wedded to class prejudice and moral superiority, refusing to acknowledge her role in Eva's downfall. I accept no blame for it at all. So we can see that Mrs. Burling really represents that obdurate upper older class who are very entrenched in their beliefs. They're very stuck in their beliefs. They refuse to change. They refuse to acknowledge their wrongdoings. Because think, if somebody's like 60 years old, they've had 60 years of believing this, and they're thinking, well, I'm not going to change my opinions for the last 20 years of my life. It served me well so far. And that's why we see older people tend to be harder to change. And that is what Priestley's really presenting with the older generation. But Priestley's been very intentional that he's made the older generation and then capitalism linked together. So therefore, because the older generation, of course, are more resistant to change and they have these capitalist attitudes, he makes capitalism seem outdated. Very clever from Priestley. And then, although younger in age, Gerald aligns ideologically with the older generation, seeking to preserve appearances and shirking, meaning avoiding, his moral transgressions, meaning going against. So we can see it's very interesting that Gerald is actually part of the younger generation, because he is Sheila and Eric's age roughly, right? Because remember, Sheila and him are getting engaged. He's not old, he's not like Mr. and Mrs. Burling, so technically he's more part of the younger generation. But ideologically, so his ideologies, his beliefs, more align with the older generation, because he wants to preserve his appearance, he's all about status, and he wants to continue to shirk, so avoid responsibility. And we can see that very clearly, that although he's part of the younger generation, in the way that he acts towards his involvement with Eva is more aligned with the old generation that we see with Mr. and Mrs. Burling. And we can see this very clearly in the end, where he says, everything's all right now, Sheila, what about this ring? So we can see he's completely dismissive of these ideas of responsibility. He is basically wanting to revert back to the original celebration of their engagement, completely dismissing the fact that him and everybody else in this room has contributed to a young girl's suicide. And then lastly, looking at Sheila. So Sheila undergoes a moral awakening, rejecting her parents' complacency and embracing Priestley's message of social accountability. So we can see here that Sheila really represents that progressive younger generation who are more malleable. So remember I said malleable is easily changed. She rejects her parents' complacency, so they're just like happy to stay at where they are. And she embraces the idea of social accountability. And we see that in the way she says, it frightens me the way you talk. And that's very an accusatory statement. So when I said she's accusing, she's being very direct to her parents. Whereas before, of course, she was under the capitalist ideology. She believed very similar things to her parents because they've almost indoctrinated means brainwashed, her with these views. But now she's developed her own conscience. Remember, conscience is knowing right from wrong. She begins to question it. And we get to see that in her very direct and accusatory tone towards her parents. So that, guys, is a full breakdown of a essay plan that you can adapt. So depending on what comes up, each of these paragraphs are kind of overall key themes, and you can just choose one of these points for each paragraph depending on what fits best. And then, of course, if you do want more of this and you like this kind of thing, you'll absolutely love the Light Up Hub, which has everything you can want in it: structures, grade 9 essays, analysis, essay plans, literally everything you could want for English, for literature and language. It's all on there. And make sure as well to subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye, guys.